Final Fantasy XV is one of the most visually stunning games of the generation, but the demands of the Luminous engine powering it could often prove too much for limited console hardware, which is where the new PC version of the game comes in. With the potential for improved visuals and faster performance, the PC platform finally allows us to experience the game at its best. And today in part 1 of our coverage, we'll be exploring the game's visual settings in great detail, checking out the PC exclusive features while stacking it up against the console version. And to do that, I'm joined by our new PC expert, Alex Battaglia.
Hello, John.
Are you ready to discuss some Final Fantasy XV?
Definitely.
Alright, so the first thing I want to do is talk about our objectives in this test and kind of how we went about testing it. So for me, I decided to focus on the high-end experience. So I'm running this on an i9 system, the 7900X, paired with a GTX Titan XP with 16 gigabytes of memory right now. And I believe Alex is going for the more mid to upper mid-tier hardware here.
That's right, John. I'm running right now a Ryzen 1700X, both at 3.4 gigahertz and 4.0 gigahertz. That is both also with 8 and 16 gigabytes of RAM for different styles of testing. This is all, of course, running on an SSD. And for AMD, I have an MSI RX 580 with a slight factory overclock. And for NVIDIA, I have a GTX 1070, also at stock.
Excellent. Okay, well, before jumping into the details, I want to discuss then the visuals on display here. Even on the consoles, this really is a truly gorgeous looking game, but I do feel like the additional options and features available on the PC version has a significant impact on the presentation in a positive way.
Yeah, I mean, the higher resolution options that you're just given on PC bring the art out fuller, and based upon the camera distances that the game tends to play at, behind your character, at higher resolutions you can just see more of that detail. It's quite wonderful.
Yeah, and honestly, I feel like this might be one of the best looking PC games I've played to date, just in terms of the visual features, the lighting on display, and just the overall sense of scale and detail.
It feels huge, John. You're just walking around in the forests or out in the fields with grass flowing next to you, and it just is a wonderful looking game. I do agree with you. I think it is actually currently, right now, the best looking game that you can buy on PC.
That's excellent. So, now the port is quite demanding, but before we get into all the features and options, I think we need to talk about some of the basics of the PC version, such as resolution, the frame rate support, and PC quality of life features. So on the resolution side, I think it's important to note that ultra-wide support is in, and it looks wonderful. I would also say that we have support for arbitrary resolutions, as I'm able to set any sort of custom resolutions, and they're all appearing here, and they do work.
And the game also has its own internal scaler, allowing you to drop between 50, 75%, 125%, etc., up to 200% of whatever resolution you choose in the menu itself.
But of course, as we'll discuss shortly, this is a game that is very sensitive to resolution in terms of performance.
Indeed.
Now, on the frame rate side, the game does offer support for high frame rates, which is great, but it does appear to be capped at 120 frames per second max.
Yeah, we couldn't test it directly because we both do not have 144, 240, or 165 hertz monitors, but it seems internally capped at 120 FPS, whether you go to the default setting or the selectable 120 FPS setting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And another thing to note, that the internal frame rate cap does not appear to function very well, and when using it, like say if you're at 60 hertz and you enable the 30 FPS cap, you get the same bad frame pacing issues that we saw on the PlayStation 4 version. Okay then, well, moving on, Alex, why don't you tell us about the quality of life features included in the PC version? I've been playing with a gamepad, but I believe you're using mouse and keyboard.
Yeah, per typical, even though this is a game that I think is really going to be great on a gamepad, I just like trying out the mouse and keyboard options in a game always, and I think they're really good. You have a ton of customizability in terms of all the controls you want, but there are some downsides. You cannot navigate the menus with a mouse, for example. You have the ability by pressing F1 to activate the mouse cursor on screen, but it doesn't really seem to do anything. You can't select anything when using it. It just shows the mouse cursor. You have the ability to, as well, customize your function keys, your F1s through F8, but F9 through F12 are not. And if you, like a lot of people on PC, use external tools, OSDs, anything like that, and you have, or even just NVIDIA's tools, for example, for recording the game, those are usually mapped to the higher function keys, and the game has its own preset higher function key settings.
So it sounds like a mixed bag then, mostly good with a few little limitations.
And yeah, I think, and also the gameplay itself maps pretty well to a keyboard and mouse, like hitting F for certain things, or blocking with right mouse button. I think it all works really well.
I did experiment a little bit with the new first-person viewpoint option, which was added to the most recent version of the game, which is pretty cool actually.
I haven't tried it out yet.
So I haven't even looked at the mapping on the keyboard, but if you double click, or if you click in both analog sticks, you can run around in first person. And I've done this with both the mouse and keyboard and the gamepad, and there's no view bobbing or anything like that. It does feel a little weird in combat, but it's kind of a neat feature, and it does allow you to get up close and personal with some of the visual features on display, which I kind of feel like is where we're going to go next in this discussion, because the options menu is absolutely loaded with things to tweak.
I'm a big fan of this options menu, John. I'm just going to throw that
great.
out there. I'm a big fan.
Yeah, and most of it is, except for the presets and the asset feature,
yes,
you can adjust most of this without having to leave the game, which is absolutely key, I think, to tweaking your performance. Okay, so I feel like we should break this down into 3 different groups. I want to talk first about the few settings that are heavier on the CPU side, then the GPU heavy settings, and then of course NVIDIA's GameWorks and how it fares on both NVIDIA and AMD hardware. Yeah. So let's start with the CPU settings. So what did you find here?
Rather typical things that affect CPU. There's not a lot of tweakable CPU settings in this game, unfortunately, in comparison to other things. But at the same time, you have typical options for shadows, whilst increasing the resolution of shadows close to you by making the cascades of a higher resolution. It also extends those cascades into the distance at higher levels, making them have more CPU draw calls for those shadows maps, which is a very CPU intensive operation. Beyond that, you also have the LOD settings. Auto LOD, John?
They call it Model LOD, and yes, of course, this is one of the heavier settings I found in terms of CPU demands, and it's also the one that I feel offers one of the most significant improvements over what you can get on the console. So we're looking here at the Xbox One X version, which is the version I'm going to be using for all of the console comparisons, as I think it's the best looking version of the game on consoles. So there's 3 settings on the PC, and Xbox One X comes in at the average setting, which is basically the medium middle setting. On PC then, you can push it up to high to further push out foliage draw distance, or drop it to low if you're having performance issues. And we'll see more as we go along here, but in general, the console versions operate around the average middle settings, though there are exceptions. Now, I also wanted to point out that the PC footage I've been using throughout the video is kind of mixed. For some shots, I'm using a fully maxed out version with all GameWorks features, everything enabled, but I'm capping it at 30 FPS. In other instances, however, I went for a 60 frames per second update, which sacrifices resolution a little bit and turns down a few details to reach a more stable level of performance. Naturally, the console versions will not be offering the GameWorks features. But anyways, I think that's pretty much most of the settings that would impact CPU performance. Can you think of anything else?
Oh, well, yeah, if we're going to talk about GameWorks settings, well, mainly later, but TurfWorks itself is both a GPU and CPU intensive option.
Oh, right, yes, of course. Okay, so most of the settings then are going to be heavy on the GPU, and thankfully with its options menu, you can actually monitor in somewhat real time how this is going to impact your performance.
Yeah, and I think you say somewhat real-time because you can, of course, change the game's options in the menu itself, and there is a nice transparency overlay, good opacity there, so you can see things happening in the background. But at the same time, when you pause the game, it pauses seemingly AI and world animation updates, so you can actually have higher CPU performance in the menus than you would have in-game.
Exactly, and I noticed this as well when playing with settings, so... All right, so the most demanding settings then, I'd say, what stands out to you as like the thing that pushes the system the hardest right here?
Without including GameWorks, I would definitely say it is Shadows.
Yes,
In terms of GPU. Basically, Shadows was the most expensive both on NVIDIA and AMD hardware, but I noticed that AMD was seeing less variability in different scenes in terms of performance when adjusting the Shadows quality option from low to highest. So that's something to consider.
And I feel like Shadows, those are always one of the settings I'm happy to turn down a little bit, especially in this case where I feel like the softer look, the filtering of the shadow cascade is done well enough that even when you set it to a lower setting, it still looks nice. Although obviously your distance is limited in terms of how much shadow is drawn. It's also worth noting that on Xbox One X, the game is using the high setting for shadows, so they do look generally quite good in this version of the game. And since we're talking about shadows, we should also discuss the Ambient Occlusion, which is very lightweight in this game, but the quality is kind of mixed. It has sort of a blotchy look in areas. So yeah, the quality isn't quite on par with something like HBAO+.
Yeah, it is a bit of a shame that we don't see that in spite of the integration of VXAO in the game, which is usually packaged with HBAO+. Yeah. Definitely not of high quality, but it's not something you should really ever want to be turning off. I've read online of people wanting to turn it off for certain reasons, but the game otherwise will not have any sort of occlusion for like small crevices, and you really need it on.
Well, beyond the small crevices, I find that it has the greatest impact on large fields of foliage. Like when you're running around in the grassy fields, if you turn it off, the game actually looks just kind of incorrect. And speaking of foliage anomalies, I also had an issue where with certain settings, the grass would actually flicker like this.
That's interesting. Was it like a planed texture, like one plane of geometry, like intersecting with the camera or something like that? I think I saw that once.
No, nothing quite like that. The entire field, as you can see in the video here, is sort of flashing wildly, and it just sort of comes and goes at different points. And I can't always replicate it, but when it shows up, it's distracting, and switching Turfworks on does solve it, which is fascinating. So other settings, I guess we should. There's the TRAM, which is the texture RAM setting, and that seems to control how much video memory the game is allowed to access, which would then enable, I guess, improved texture streaming and slightly higher quality textures.
Yeah, closer to the camera.
But from what I'm understanding, it seems like the highest option is only really usable on a 12 gigabyte GPU.
Oh, is it?
Otherwise, you're gonna end up with stuttering over time.
Oh, that's interesting. I did try the game out on Titan X Maxwell, and I did not notice any stuttering from VRAM.
Well, that's at 12 gigs, right?
Yeah, of course. But I guess on lower ones, I hadn't really considered it that it'd be doing that. Yeah, good point.
Yeah, so there's that. Another thing that's one of the best features I think they've added to this is what they call Geo Mapping, which appears to be sort of a tessellation feature applied to essentially the terrain that you're standing on.
Yeah, you don't really seem to see any. I didn't notice any, at least, on distributed rocks or on skinnable geometry itself, like character models. It was mainly just on the ground textures. Yes.
And as you can see here, comparing this to the Xbox One X version again, it is extremely effective on surfaces like the sand here, where you really have like this detailed undulation in the terrain. It looks awesome. Then there's lighting, and the main thing I noticed here is that when you set it to low, it disables screen space reflections on things like water and the car paint. It may also control the quality of the global illumination, but it's a little difficult to say for sure. Thankfully, the performance penalty is rather small, but it's very difficult to see any visual difference at all between, say, average and highest. And then anti-aliasing is an interesting one, as on consoles and by default on the PC, the game uses its own temporal anti-aliasing feature, which we found is fairly demanding in terms of the impact to performance.
Yeah, a surprising demand on the GPU. I was noticing different frame differentials than you, but even at 40 or 60 FPS, I was seeing at times 10 to a little bit more percentage of performance drop when using TAA in comparison to off.
But clearly, a lot of the visual elements, I feel, were designed with this feature in mind, such as the hair and just the display of certain transitions at points.
Yeah, like between roads and the terrain itself. And there's also points in time where it has detriments to your visual acuity in the game for how clear it looks or for a couple visual elements themselves. For example, like when looking through any sort of transparency, you can see then this kind of stippled effect in screen space, which is basically an area where the TA breaks. You also see at lower resolutions, like I would say 1080p or lower, the temporal anti-aliasing has the tendency to make the game look rather unfocused or blurry. And John, you would know this more than I would, but higher DPI displays or just higher resolution displays in general really make the TAA work surprisingly well.
Yes, I agree. It looks great when running at 4K or near 4K resolutions and testing at 1080p. Yeah. And this is the same issue we've seen on the console versions before, where they do appear extremely blurry at these lower resolutions.
Yeah, one thing of note is, of course, that not just blur, but you can also see, at least at 30 and 60 hertz pretty well, ghosting for certain things like alpha effects or large combat movements, like when Noctis does a flip or he swings his sword.
Yes, absolutely. And another thing I want to talk about then is what they call the high-res pack, which is available as an option here, as it's called assets in the game, and you can only turn this off and on by visiting the main menu. But essentially what this does is firstly, the reason it's so large is it includes 4K versions of all the movie files in both Japanese and English. So you're looking at like 50 gigabytes or something of video files in here. But it does actually improve the visuals. Well, it's debatable whether it's always an improvement. So basically what they did here is swap in a new set of assets. So there's some new textures. They updated the foliage in a lot of scenes. And, well, you can see what it looks like here on the screen. And I'm not sure how I feel about it. I mean, it looks good, but the art change is drastic enough where it does kind of look different than the original vision.
Yeah, I'm not also really sure or positive about this change. Having higher grass is not the same as having lower grass, and I'm curious why they decided to do that. It'll obviously run worse as more, transparency is drawn on the screen, and just larger bits of screen real estate are taken up by transparency. So this is like I would say, optional artistic taste option for those who enjoy it.
So that's a nice thing, but an interesting thing.
In terms of motion blur, another option that we're offered here, it should be noted that the game's motion blur quality is just kind of okay during normal scenes when you're spinning your camera. It doesn't seem to apply to character movement only until you get into combat, and at which point it has a very low motion blur pause or motion blur shutter speed, leading the game to look, at least at 30 hertz or 30 FPS targets, to look a little bit framey.
Yeah, I agree. It's not great. It would be nice to see some object blur applied throughout with a different shutter speed. So now we have to talk about GameWorks. These features are interesting, and some of them are actually quite useful in this game. Now, running on the Titan XP, I can push all of these out and still reach 60 frames per second as long as I keep the resolution in check. But I think the most important one here is turf effects.
Turf effects is interesting. It seems to use geometrically based models for the grass itself, which also cast shadow maps, different than the normal alpha blended vegetation that you see in the game, which just has AO applied to it. It tends to alias a bit more at lower resolution since it's not alpha blended, but in general it offers like a high amount of interactivity and just looks really good. It's pretty thick too. They added it everywhere in the game.
Yeah, and I also think this setting, when in conjunction with the assets option, TurfWorks does appear different depending on whether you're using the high-res pack or not. So,
do you have a preference there, John?
I prefer to use assets off with turf effects enabled. Okay, and then we have the VXAO, which is an excellent feature here, but it is fairly demanding. So what did you find on this?
I found that on a normal NVIDIA GPU, like this GTX 1070 that I have, VXAO was in the reasonable category. I think turf effects, if you have an NVIDIA GPU, is almost a must-have option, but VXAO is expensive enough, and it has a variable expense as well. In certain scenes where there's less objects that need to be voxelized, you will have a higher performance than, say, in a city, where there's more objects that are just occluding things all the time. But it is a world space calculation, so it is like physically correct. There won't be any incorrect shadowing. It just may be a bit of a lower resolution as it only applies to larger medium-sized objects.
Right, okay, great. Then there's the shadow libs.
This is an option not available on AMD hardware. NVIDIA hardware can enable it, and it uses conservative rasterization, which is a since Maxwell hardware feature, and it's also part of the DX12 superset. And you can emulate it through a geometry shader, but they have just seemingly not chosen to do that for this game. So you don't get it on AMD, but NVIDIA, you can enable it. And it's pretty great. I didn't find it very expensive on my Maxwell and Pascal hardware, and it offers really precise, almost stencil shadow looking tiny detail shadows. It's you'd see it under like Noctis's nose, or on it avoids shadow bias issues where an object could be dislocated from its shadow underneath it, which you see in a lot of games that use shadow maps. It's pretty great. I think this is a not too expensive thing if you have upper to high end NVIDIA hardware like GTX 1070 and above, or the equivalent from the 900 series.
Very well. And then there's Hairworks, which despite the fabulous hair on the characters, is not applied to the models, as I think those were carefully crafted by the artists. Instead, Hairworks is applied to, thus far I've only seen some of the larger creatures wandering about the terrain.
Yeah, I have only seen it on these large hairy beasts. I forget their name, which makes me actually really wonder about the art on the original model. It's very plain. I'm surprised they didn't use their normal hair technique like they use for the cats and the characters on these.
Perhaps a performance limitation issue there. But either way, it looks good, but I did find that it's one of those effects that works much better at a high resolution. It looks a little muddy at 1080p or lower.
It is also important to note that it does scale with the shadows option, so the higher setting you have for shadows makes Hairworks look better, because those, like, hair, for it to look proper, it needs to like have shadows and occlusion within the hair volume itself. And at lower shadow settings, you end up with such a low resolution shadow that you can barely see shadows within the Hairworks volume. And this is a setting where you basically already need to have high settings to be running it in general, and high resolution. Yeah.
Okay, we've been going on about settings for quite a while here, and I think the takeaway is that Final Fantasy XV is a nicely scalable game with a wealth of options for PC users that allow for a great experience on a wide variety of PCs. Now, we've already shown plenty of Xbox One X comparisons, but just to reiterate, most settings fall around the average level when using the high quality mode on the Xbox One X and the PS4 Pro, with shadows bumped up to the high setting available on the PC. So really, the PC advantage stems from the option to increase detail beyond what was previously possible, while boosting performance, which is a key thing that is going to have to wait. We've been talking for quite a while now, so be sure to check in for part 2 when we examine the game's performance on a variety of PCs. But for the time being, thanks for joining me, Alex.
Oh, thanks a lot, John. It was a pleasure.
And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow us over on Twitter. And until next time, this is John and Alex signing off.